All right, let's dive into Paris. You guys sent us like a ton of articles and notes about Paris, and wow, just looking at it all makes me want a croissant.
It's funny you should say that because one thing that really stands out from all this material is, well, how much it goes beyond the typical Paris is for lovers stuff.
Yo, I like that. Like, yeah, the romantic and picture perfect Paris is definitely there,
Yeah, there's definitely that.
but there's also what, a deeper, maybe grittier side.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot about like the more complex side of life in Paris, the history, and how it's all evolved.
I'm into it. So many articles talk about the unique charm of Paris, but what is it really? Beyond the pretty postcards, what'd you find?
One thing that really struck me is how Paris it blends historical richness with this like modern edge.
Hmm.
You see it in the architecture, like your sources mentioned Haussmann's grand boulevards. But the interesting thing is they were actually a solution to a public health crisis. They literally widened the streets to, improve sanitation and prevent the spread of disease.
Wow, I had no idea. Like a total city makeover, but for like a really practical reason.
Exactly.
It's amazing how, like, even the most iconic parts of Paris have these hidden stories.
Right.
So it's not just like a museum city stuck in time. It's
Yeah.
constantly like adapting and evolving.
Absolutely.
And speaking of evolving, one thing that always draws me to Paris is the art, the literature, all those creative giants, you know?
Oh, yeah.
What did the sources say about all that?
Well, you have a note here about Café Procope, the oldest cafe in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just a place to, like, grab coffee. It was this hub of, like, intellectual and artistic exchange. Imagine Voltaire and Benjamin Franklin sitting there, debating philosophy over a cup of joe.
Oh, wow.
And your sources point out that this was, like, totally normal. Parisian cafes were where movements were born, where artists like Picasso found inspiration and writers like Hemingway, honed their craft.
Chills. Just thinking about all those brilliant minds like gathered in those cafes shaping history and art.
It's pretty incredible.
It makes me want to like book a flight just to soak up that atmosphere.
And it wasn't just the big names. One article talks about this lesser-known artist, Suzanne Valadon, who, get this, was a model for Toulouse-Lautrec before becoming a celebrated painter herself.
Oh, wow.
Her story really shows how Paris, even with its rigid social structures, offered opportunities for people to break through and make their mark.
That's a great point. It's like Paris has this duality. It's super traditional, but also a place where boundaries are pushed and innovation thrives.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's be honest, even with all this talk of cafes and art movements, for a lot of people, the initial draw of Paris is still those big landmarks, the Eiffel Tower, the Louvre. What did you find out about those places?
Well, one thing that stood out is how those landmarks represent different, like, layers of Parisian history. You have a note here about the Roman roots of Paris.
Right.
How it was once called Lutetia.
Yeah.
And you can still see remnants of that era today, like the Arena of Lutetia,
Oh, yeah.
which is now a sports complex.
Wait, so I could be playing tennis where gladiators once battled.
Exactly. It reminds you that, beneath this modern city, there are centuries of history buried there. And then you have landmarks like Notre Dame, which speaks to the city's religious and architectural heritage.
Yeah.
And of course, the Eiffel Tower, which, believe it or not, was initially met with a lot of resistance, but, ultimately became a symbol of modernity and innovation.
That's so interesting. It's like these landmarks tell the story of how Paris evolved. But I'm also kind of fascinated by this mention of the catacombs beneath the city.
Oh, yeah.
Millions of skeletal remains, huh? A bit creepy, but also super compelling. What's the story there?
Yeah, the catacombs are kind of wild. They show how Paris, like, literally grew on top of its own history. I mean, they were originally quarries, but as the city got bigger and cemeteries overflowed, they became let's say, a unique solution to overcrowding.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark reminder of the challenges of a growing city, but also a fascinating, if slightly eerie, glimpse into the past.
It's like this whole hidden world underneath the bustling streets.
Yeah.
A secret history. Speaking of hidden worlds, one thing that always gets me about Paris is that joie de vivre. It's more than just a cliche, right?
Yeah.
What did the sources say about what that actually looks like, that Parisian way of life?
Oh, it's definitely more than a saying. One article describes, like, a typical Parisian Sunday routine, and it really captures that joie de vivre perfectly.
I'm listening.
So they start with a leisurely stroll through a local market, picking out fresh produce, flowers, that kind of thing. Then it's off to a cafe for, a croissant and coffee, maybe a chat with friends or neighbors. The afternoon might involve a visit to a museum or park, followed by a, like, delicious home-cooked meal with loved ones.
Wow, you're making me want to move to Paris.
Right. It's all about slowing down, savoring the simple things, and connecting with your community.
Such a good reminder, really, for all of us.
Totally. And it's not just about individual experiences. The city itself is like designed for that joie de vivre.
Yeah.
Your sources mentioned the tons of green spaces like the Jardin du Luxembourg, which is apparently a favorite spot for Parisians to, relax and escape the city craziness.
Makes sense.
And then there's the Seine, which of course is more than just a river. It's a social space, a place for like picnics, boat rides, or just strolling along the banks.
Sounds idyllic.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about history, art, and joie de vivre. But one thing that's always intimidated me about Paris is the food scene. It's so famous, it's almost overwhelming. What did you find in your research about how Parisians think about food?
One thing that kept coming up is that for Parisians, food is more than just, fuel. It's an art form, a way to express their culture.
Hmm.
And it's not just fancy restaurants either. One source tells this great story about a local bakery where the owner spends like hours each morning perfecting his sourdough recipe.
Wow, really?
It's that dedication, that craftsmanship that makes even a simple Parisian meal feel so special.
That's so cool. It's like the attention to detail, the passion, that makes all the difference. It's not just about Michelin stars. It's about appreciating good food in all its forms.
Speaking of good food, I got to ask about cafe culture. It's such an iconic part of the Parisian experience, but what makes it so unique?
Well, one source described Parisian cafes as extensions of the living room.
Interesting.
They're not just for a quick coffee. They're social hubs, places to meet up with friends, read the paper, or even just people watch for hours.
I could totally see that. And it's not just a tourist thing. Parisians are like super loyal to their local cafes. They go to the same one for years,
Yeah.
building relationships with the owners, the staff.
Yeah.
It becomes part of their daily routine, their community.
I love that sense of community, that feeling of belonging is like the cafe becomes a home away from home. You mentioned fashion earlier, and I have to admit, one of my fantasies about Paris is strolling down those chic streets looking effortlessly stylish. What did your research say about how Parisians approach fashion?
Well, one thing that stood out was that Parisian style isn't about chasing trends. It's more about, like, building your own personal aesthetic.
Oh, interesting.
It's about buying quality pieces that last and expressing yourself through your clothes. It's not about being flashy. It's about effortless chic, the certain je ne sais quoi.
It's like they have it figured out. That confidence is definitely something I admire about Parisians.
Totally. And it goes beyond clothes, too. It's about how they carry themselves, how they appreciate the beauty in everyday life. Whether it's the way they arrange flowers or set a table, Parisians have this, like, innate sense of style in everything they do.
Okay, so we've got the history, the art, the joie de vivre, the food, the fashion. We're getting the full picture. But I'm still a little overwhelmed. For someone who's never been to Paris, like, where do you even start? What are the must-sees, the must-dos?
I think it's less about checking things off a list and more about finding what speaks to you.
Okay.
One article suggested starting with a neighborhood that fits your interests. If you're into art, head to Montmartre, which is still a hub for artists and galleries.
Right.
Or, if you're a history buff, explore the Latin Quarter with its Roman ruins and historic universities.
Got it.
Just let your curiosity be your guide.
Love that. Instead of trying to see it all, focus on what really interests you. But even with a focused approach, navigating a city as big and busy as Paris can be kind of scary. Any practical tips?
One thing that came up a lot in the sources was the importance of walking.
Walking.
Yeah, Paris is best explored on foot.
Makes sense.
Get lost in those little side streets, stumble upon hidden courtyards, really soak in the atmosphere, and don't be afraid to ask for directions. Parisians might have a reputation, but most are happy to help.
That's good to know. I love the idea of just like wandering and seeing where the city takes me. Speaking of navigating, what about transportation? Is the metro easy to use?
The metro is, like, incredibly efficient and affordable, and it goes pretty much everywhere.
Good to know.
One article even suggested getting a vintage metro map as a souvenir.
Oh, that's fun.
Yeah, it's a cool way to track your adventures.
I love that. Okay, I'm feeling more confident about tackling Paris. But one last thing, and this might sound silly, but what about the language barrier? My French is, well, pretty basic.
Don't sweat it. You'll find that lots of Parisians, especially in touristy areas, speak at least some English.
Oh, okay, good.
But learning a few key phrases like bonjour, merci, s'il vous plaît will go a long way. And honestly, even if you mess up a little, Parisians appreciate the effort. It shows you're trying to, engage with their culture.
That makes sense. A little effort goes a long way. Okay, so we've covered a lot, but I have to ask, is there one like quintessential Parisian experience you'd recommend? Something that really captures the essence of the city?
That's a tough one. There are so many amazing things to do in Paris, but if I had to pick just one, I'd say it's that simple act of, like, sitting at a sidewalk cafe, watching the world go by,
Yeah.
order a coffee, a glass of wine, whatever, and just soak it all in. Let yourself get swept away by the rhythm of Parisian life. It's a cliche for a reason. It really is magical.
You're making me want to go, like, right now. But for those of us who can't hop on a plane this second, is there a way to bring a bit of that Parisian magic home?
For sure. One source recommended exploring Parisian-inspired movies and books, like picture yourself curled up with a copy of A Movable Feast or watching Amélie.
Oh, I love Amelie.
That's a great way to transport yourself to Paris, experience it through different eyes.
It's like a mini vacation without leaving your couch. We've covered so much in this deep dive. History, art, food, fashion, even how to get a taste of Paris from home. I'm feeling super inspired.
Any final thoughts for our listeners before we wrap things up?
As we've been talking about Paris, I keep thinking about how one source mentioned the Seine River.
Oh, yeah.
It's not just a waterway, it's almost like a character in the story of Paris, wouldn't you say?
Totally. The Seine is like the heart of the city. It splits Paris into the left bank and right bank. Each one has like its own personality.
Yeah.
Speaking of, I've heard those terms, but to be honest, what's the difference? Is it really just like artsy versus fancy?
Oh, it's definitely more than that. The left bank is known for its bohemian and intellectual history.
Okay.
So it's often associated with the Sorbonne University, the Latin Quarter, and all those cafes where like philosophers and writers used to hang out.
So that's the side where I'd be sipping espresso and pretending to understand Sartre. But don't forget, the left bank also has its share of elegance and grandeur. One of your sources talk about the Jardin du Luxembourg, which is this gorgeous palace garden that's perfect for a, relaxing walk.
Right.
And there's the Musée d'Orsay, which is in a former train station. It has a ton of incredible Impressionist and post-Impressionist art.
Well, so it's a mix of like bohemian vibes and sophisticated stuff. That's what I love about Paris. What about the right bank? What's it like?
The right bank is often seen as the more modern and commercial side. It's got big boulevards like the Champs-Élysées and iconic landmarks like the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower.
Of course.
But it's also got some really historic neighborhoods like Le Marais.
Right, with that cool mix of medieval buildings and modern shops. So both banks have something unique to offer. It's like two cities in one. But thinking about all these different neighborhoods and the history, has Paris changed a lot over time? Is it still the same city that inspired all those artists and writers?
That's a great question. And actually, your sources talk about that. Paris has definitely modernized and evolved, but it's also really protective of its heritage.
Yeah.
There are strict rules to preserve the city's architecture. So even with new developments, there's a huge respect for tradition and history.
That's pretty amazing. It's like they've found a way to balance like progress with preserving the past. One thing I've noticed in all these articles is the emphasis on the Parisian lifestyle. It's not just about the sights, it's a way of being. What did you learn about that je ne sais quoi?
One thing that kept popping up was the idea of slowing down and enjoying the little things.
Now that that.
Parisians are masters of, the art of living. They take time to enjoy a good meal, connect with friends and family, and appreciate the beauty around them.
That's something we could all learn from no matter where we live.
Right. Just taking a moment to pause, appreciate, and find those moments of beauty. It's a good reminder in today's world.
Totally. One source made this interesting point about how Parisians have a unique relationship with their city.
Yeah, how so?
It's not just a place where they live, it's part of them, a source of pride.
Yeah. They're active participants in city life, whether it's going to their local market, seeing a concert in a park, or having lively debates at their favorite cafe.
It seems like they really get what it means to live in a city. Well, after this deep dive, I'm definitely ready to experience Paris. Any final advice for our listeners who are probably feeling the same way?
I think the most important thing is to be open-minded and adventurous when you visit Paris.
Good advice.
Don't try to do everything. Just wander, get lost, and be surprised. And really be open to connecting with the people, the culture, the whole spirit of the city.
Well said. And remember, like we've been saying, this is just the start of your Parisian adventure.
Absolutely.
There's a whole world waiting for you to discover, so bon voyage.
Bon voyage.
Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm off to brush up on my French and dream about strolling along the Seine. Until next time, keep exploring.